Hey, this is Stushu, and today I wanted to do a video about SuperNova's Art of War, and SuperNova was a StarCraft 2 player, so this will be part of my StarCraft 2 history series. So, let's get into it. What makes SuperNova an interesting player, in my view, is he really is defined by that Sun Tzu quote, and thus I'm calling this the Art of War, SuperNova's Art of War is, the quote goes, "If you know yourself and you know the enemy, need not fear the result of 100 battles." And when I look at SuperNova's career now, like years later, I think that really did define his career. As a player, he was incredibly intelligent, but he was nowhere near talented enough to ever be considered a top X player. Doesn't matter what kind of context you use. He's not going to be in a top 30 greatest of all time list. He's not going to be in the best Terrans list. He's not going to be in the best Heart of the Swarm players, or even Heart of Storm Terrans, or Wings of Liberty, there or whatever. He'll never be in any of those lists. And so that makes this video a bit rare in the sense that I very rarely talk about players outside of the elites, basically the best champions or the best runner-ups or top fours, or that side of the competition. And the reason I've generally preferred to talk about those players is because I think when you're talking about champions, they generally in esports competitions, they generally have the highest correlation to individuality you'll see. So they have the most stylistic tendencies. There'll be guys who define the paradigm and force the paradigm into their own image, in a sense. And so they're always using their most particular individualistic characteristics to win the game. And I think that's the most interesting part of, not the most interesting, but one of the most interesting aspects of esports competition is your self-expression, the art you can kind of imbue into this competition, and getting a direct, objective, as close to as objective result as you can get out of it. So it's not like a true artistic medium where like you draw a painting and like others subjectively kind of grade it or whatever. Like you get a direct objective view. It's like, oh, how were you? Did you win? Did you get second, third, what, etc. Right? And in this context, then, like, even though SuperNova is nowhere close to being one of the all-time greats of any of these games, any of these categories, he is still one of my favorite players to watch, even after all these years, because I think he was an incredibly individualistic player in a lot of different ways. And in particular, strategically speaking, I always thought he gave himself the best possible chances, because I always thought, and this might be a self-affirming delusion on my part, take it with a grain of salt, but basically I always thought, when I watched those games, and I've rewatched those games since, I always thought SuperNova correctly assessed his own strengths and his own weaknesses, correctly evaluated his enemy strengths, his enemy weaknesses, then within the context of both the meta and the map he was playing in and their relative forms, he always came up with the best possible strategies or builds or compositions to give himself the best chance to win. And that didn't mean he always won. Actually, he very rarely got that deep. To be honest, he wasn't, like I said, his results weren't that great, but he always gave himself the best chance possible. And that's something I've always respected about SuperNova's game. It's always been one of the reasons why I thought he was such a brilliant player, despite the complete lack of results to back that up, because I thought he was so smart in so many different time periods. And for this video, I'm mostly going to be focusing on his 2011 to 2014 period, but let's start with the context, basically, of what makes SuperNova different from your standard Terran. So SuperNova generally had two styles of play he could enforce, right? The first was your typical Korean standard Terran play. Give me a moment. And so that's defined by, MVP in 2014, MVP in 2011 to 2012, innovation from 2013 onwards, all the way until we get to like modern day. But we're going to ignore the modern day because for SuperNova, we're just focusing on Wings of Liberty to Heart of the Swarm. So he could play most of those styles, but he was never great at them. And even if he had I'll go ahead and say, even if he had spent all of his time practicing and refining those styles, he would never have been even close to, let's say, innovation. Like, for instance, this has always been a criticism I've had of Kespa Terrans in general after a lot of them transferred over from Brood War to StarCraft 2 was, unlike their Zerg or Protoss counterparts from the Kespa period, a lot of them just copied innovation. And I always felt that was like a disservice to themselves as players and just a terrible strategy, because that always just made them like pale imitations of what innovation was. And I think it's basically borne out. Like if you just look at the Terrans who survived that period from the Kespa transfer over, that became legitimate like championship contenders, is really only like TY, really. Like, I guess if you want, you could include Flash, but I think Flash had some unique aspects to his play that were a bit different from innovation. But beyond that, they weren't really, and even then, Flash didn't like last that long. Like beyond that, there really weren't any. Like Maru himself, if you want to count him, even though he played years before Kespa joined. And in SuperNova's case, he was a unique player because he besides playing the standard style, and the standard style, even though it wasn't his is basically his unorthodox style, and is the one he used specifically for foreign tournaments. And this is important to note because I think it's important to note, just strategically speaking, because I think that's actually a very smart move on his part. And I'll go into that because I'm not going to go into the foreign tournaments, but basically from that time period, you'll always notice that foreign Korean Terrans do particularly well against foreign players. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think mirror matchups can have a certain level of variance to them, where PvP or ZVZ, you're more likely to get upset. I think ZVZ less so. I actually think it's arguable that European ZVZ has always been pretty close to Korean ZVZ. So maybe that's another reason why that one was pretty close. But when you come to the Korean Terrans against generally the foreign players, the Terrans have done better. And the reason is because just mechanically, in terms of decision making, and in terms of the way the standard styles play out, like you can't really, it was really hard to cheese one. And in turn, like a Terran with good decision making, good mechanics, good, just the overall package, if you want to call that, could always force the game into a standard mode of operation. And if you force the game to a standard mode of operation, you're the better player, you're likely to come out on top most of the time. And that's actually why, like, basically this is the game plan of innovation throughout his entire career, is if you get him into a meta where Terran is like 50.5% favored, he's almost always going to win. And that's because he can take a like small percentage and he can increase it with his own refinements, his own macro, his own micro, take it to the nth degree, and force the game down a normal standardized path. But he will be in control the entire time, and the only way you can knock innovation out is you have to force the game off the rails. Like basically, I forget which caster described it, but some Korean caster a long time ago said it was kind of like railroad making or something, whereas like if you're trying to describe StarCraft 2, basically two players are trying to build railroads as fast as they can, and whoever finishes their railroad first, like basically whoever finishes their build, their timing, their composition, generally wins. And so everybody has like a stratified plan, and so in order to take out something like innovation, you have to like fuck up his railroad building somehow. So that's kind of like the metaphor, right? And SuperNova, if he had tried that, he'd have failed. He was nowhere near talented enough to do that and to like play against a bunch of the players he did during this time period. His other style though was quite interesting. Basically, he was a player who, like, if you want to talk, like his modern equivalent or the closest to that is probably, I'd say it's probably TY. Except it's different enough that I wouldn't put them in the same category. So if you know TY, you know this guy loves his unorthodox multitasking aggression. He loves, like, I think a lot of people define or characterize TY as being a very smart Terran, arguably one of the smartest Terrans we've seen, because he always has these unique little tricks, little gimmicks that give him an edge or whatever. Except the difference between TY and SuperNova is that TY actually has the mechanics and skill to back it up in a normal standard game. That's why he's always been one of the better Terrans, even during a time period where I'd say he was a terrible series player. And that's always been like it's always been one of TY's strengths. But what if you took that out of TY, like as in took out his micro, he took out his macro, then you probably get some version of Supernova. The difference though between their multitasking aggression, their early multitasking aggression, is Supernova always had like a 4 or 5 step process to his, as in he played StarCraft closer to how someone might play dominoes. He set up little traps or little aggressions that fed from one step to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And the reason he did this was because he wanted to force control onto the opposing enemy. And by forcing control on the opposing enemy, not only is he getting information, but he's basically forcing them down a path. He's forcing them down a path where they take a shit ton of damage. And so once they eventually transition, either they die or they transition to a normal game. But once they transition to the normal game, Supernova is ahead, theoretically speaking, if he does good enough damage. And once Supernova's ahead, he doesn't have to worry about his micro or macro as much anymore. Because even though at times he's good or decent at it, he was never incredible at it. So if he got to that point with his multitasking aggression in the early game, and we're going to go over some examples later, if he got to that point, then he basically nullifies his own weakness at the mid to early game with his raw mechanics. And he basically, that's always been his plan against Koreans, right? Or in general, the best players he's played against throughout his time period. So let's start talking about some examples from his career. And we're going to go through a few of the ones I picked out. I don't actually have the VOD links. You can look them up on Wikipedia. I'll just name out the player and then the tournament. So round of 16, the first one I'm going to talk about is mostly going to be about TVZ and TVP for the most part. But there will be one TVT where it is important to note because I think it was like one of the most brilliantly played series I'd ever seen. So start with the first one, 2011 Codes October against DRG. And this is the round 16, back when it was a 16-man single elimination bracket for the playoffs. And DRG at this time, he was a top 3 player. He might have been a top 3 player, but he's definitely a top 3 Zerg. It's either him, Lenok, or Nestea. And I'd argue his top 2 or best at this particular moment in time. Now, Supernova was a good Terran, probably one of the better Terrans in the world, but in order to beat DRG, here are the winning conditions for Supernova. He either had to play a very aggressive game and kill DRG before he got the Mutalisk Ling Baneling. And the reason you had to kill DRG before Mutalisk Ling Baneling is because that is DRG's forte. That is his moment of pure strength. Like, if you want to see DRG at his prime, you don't actually go to see 2011, even though that's technically his prime, or 2012. You actually go to 2013 and watch that guy play against Innovation. Fucking fantastic series, where basically it's like the Biomine Medevac era of TVZ, and it's like a high pace, very very intense mechanical period for TVZ. And DRG is literally the only guy I saw. Like, Sulky and Curious have both beaten Innovation in that time period, but both of them used a lot more smarts to do it. DRG just straight up said, okay, I'll play your game in your game and I'll beat you. And DRG did it. It's like the only guy I saw during that time period do that. So so if you're just thinking about the strategy of this particular series between DRG and Supernova, either beat him in the early game or beat him in the end game. And this is something you can only think about in retrospect, so I don't actually know how much Supernova could have known this at the time. But basically, DRG, he wasn't that good in the end game. Like, he was all right because, it was Brutal Infestor was about to come in. But in actuality, like his end game wasn't nearly as good as his mid game or early late game, when he can really run the map with Mitas, Lings, and Banelings. And so for Supernova, in order to beat DRG, he either had to do one, he had to kill him before it started, or survive long enough to transition to the end game. And that's what Supernova does. Like, and here's credit to Supernova, because I actually think in terms of form, this is probably the highest form he ever played in. Right? And this is why I think he did recognize his strategic strengths. This is why I think he did have very strong self-evaluation ability, because this is the only time you ever see Supernova play standard against a championship contender, really. Most of the times he doesn't. Most of the times he tries to trick, or go off the rails of the metagame. But this one he plays DRG straight up, and the reason he does that is because Supernova is in his prime, and he realizes that he does actually have a very good chance of beating DRG in a straight up game. So he opts to play the end game, as I said. But in order to play the end game, you're gonna have to survive throughout the entire period where DRG is super aggressive. And I think there's basically two factors as to why Supernova allows this. First, like I said, his form is quite good. The second reason, I think, is because of the maps he gets to play on. I think the first one is Daybreak, and Daybreak, as you know, like it's a very like split map scenario, so it's actually not that good for DRG's style of play, Metalist Ling Baneling play. And then same thing for Metalopolis to a lesser degree, because even though like it's kind of far, even though the bases are kind of far out, you can kind of split it ish. So basically, that's what Supernova does, and in order to establish his entry into the mid game, Supernova basically starts with like Blue Flame Hellion aggression into tank bio. Basically tries to survive. Sometimes he does some aggression just to push DRG back and then pull back. And then they keep trading until eventually Supernova gets to the end game and Supernova finally pushes out and wins. That's generally how these games play out. And what's interesting is we're going to talk a bit about his series planning here. So in game one and game two, he kind of trades. Game one, he beats DRG and Daybreak. Like I said, it's a good map. It's a good map for nullifying a bit of DRG style. Go to game two. Game two, you play a Metalopolis. I actually think this map is probably a bit more suited for DRG style, especially because DRG made the clever adjustment where he included Nidus Swarms into his build. And so even though Nidus Swarms were kind of crap in terms of overall strength, because you could just shoot it down before it formed back then, because of the fog in each base, it was hard to keep track of all that shit, especially when DRG was being very aggressive. And like he could move Mutalisk there, kill anything that was there. If they happen to build something behind the smoke, go back, then rebuild it, and then attack somewhere else, and then all of a sudden you're distracted. It's like kind of misdirection. So DRG is able to use his Nidus Muta play to really run Supernova ragged across the map, and then he transitions over to tier 3. And so in DRG's case, even though like you got the end game, like DRG did enough damage in the mid game and late game for the transition to work and for him to run over Supernova. Then you go to game 3. Game 3 is Crossfire. And this is where we talk a bit about Supernova's planning. Because like I said, he either had two choices, kill him in the end game or kill him in the early game. He already did the end game part, and this is important because basically Supernova establishes a legitimate threat in the end game. And that's important against somebody like DRG, because DRG is, if you don't establish yourself as a threat in the end game, you're not he's not going to think. Basically, a lot of people try to kill DRG pretty early on. So if you don't establish a threat in the end game, he's going to like play more defensive. He's going to He's going to do a bit more scouting. He's not going to cut as many corners in the macro-wise. And this is important because you get to game 3, get the crossfire. And then SuperNova does the similar build where he's like, I'll start with Hellions, take map control. But what he does is he cheeses economically. He builds a command center at an off location to get the gold base. DRG doesn't scout this. And even when DRG takes map control, he doesn't see this because he assumes that SuperNova is going to play a standard game because SuperNova has already proven he could beat DRG in a standard game. Doesn't do it. Doesn't do it because basically by doing the ordering of this particular map series in such a way, SuperNova is able to mask his cheese in game 3. Uses that gold advantage, beats DRG. And then he gets eliminated next round. But, it's the way of SuperNova. And then we're going to talk a bit about his TVP, SuperNova's TVP. So SuperNova, if you look at the way he played that particular matchup, he was all right standard-wise in terms of the standard play. But his biggest problem is he couldn't attack. What I mean by that is, how do I want to explain this? Right, if you want to see in my opinion, the peak of TVP fight, battle micro, you want to see Maru in 2013 to 2014. And the reason I pointed to those two particular time periods is basically Maru does everything perfectly during those time periods. Like, in order to actually... Yeah, or you might want to see Marine King in 2012. I think those are the ones you want to look at. Maybe Marine King in 2012 is a better example for this particular context. But basically, in order to be very good at TVP, you have to win the team fights. Not team fights. You have to win the team fucking max battles between the two armies, right? And in order to win as Terran, you had to micro into the Protoss, because eventually you have to attack, right? And in order to win against that, you have to do a few things. First, you have to stim and stutter step back, but stutter step forward and then stutter step back. And then you have to split your armies in such a way where you reduce the amount of damage the Colossus could do to you because with its range AoE shit. Then you had to split your army in such a way where the Storm's going to hit you and you could EMP or snipe the High Templars, depending on what patch you're talking about. And at the same time, you had to stutter step and single target with your Vikings. And you couldn't just single target all the Colossus with your Vikings because there was an interplay between the Protoss and the Terran, where if the Protoss figured out you're doing that, they'd move the Colossus back, link their Vikings forward, and if you just randomly shift right click all the Colossus, the Vikings will move forward, and then the Stalkers will kill all the Vikings, and then you're screwed. So there's a lot of interplay between both sides here. And if you're splitting too far for the High Templars for the Terran side, you're not doing enough damage from your bio. And so in this kind of scenario, SuperNova was kind of crap. Like, he wasn't very good at it. If I threw him against any of the top Protosses or even just good Protosses in one of these death ball battles, that's what it was called back then. If I threw him into one of those, I think SuperNova would lose 20 to 80. He'd only win 20% of the time in these scenarios, right? So basically, what SuperNova had to do to dodge this entire issue was he had to create a style where he was willing, where it kind of dodged all of his problems. And he basically does this in 3 different ways. First, he actually still plays standard. And this is important to note, because this is the difference between playing to the meta and playing to the meta in such a way as to enable your own individuality. Because if you don't play standard at all, you're never going to create a legitimate threat for Protoss players to not just cut out all the variations that have to counter the standard. So that's important to note. But he rarely pulls it out against the top players, but he pulls it out every once in a while just to prove he can do it. Kind of. And then his 2 primary ways of winning is either the 1-1-1, thanks to Puma, And the whole point of the 1-1-1 is you just kill them before you get there. And what's brilliant about the 1-1-1 is you're basically like forcing it into like small micro engagements, and they're actually easier to micro than the death ball battles I was talking about. And then his other answer, which was unique to Supernova, was he would go with Cloak Banshee. He'd go with Cloak Banshee openers, pray he'd do a shit ton of damage, and then transition that into a Thor, Marine, SCV, Cloak Banshee all in. And the whole point of this is if you kind of fucked up the observers, he could scan, kill the observers, and then kill you with everything. Or he'd hope that the SCVs, Thors, and Banshees could out-repair, out-DPS you in the long run. But this only ever worked like maybe once or twice. It was not a very good composition. But it was a smart composition considering the fact that I think he was more likely to win with that than he was to win with like a death ball battle against top Protosses. And this is basically something he does against MC. Like basically this is how he plays against MC in season 1 of Codes 2012. This is how he plays against Puzzle, I think, in... Let's see. This is how he plays against Puzzle in season... I think it's the same season, actually. This is also how he plays against Seed in season 2 of 2012. Also how he plays against Genius. So, in general... And he plays against Oz, and then he kind of gets like murdered by Hero because of this. Let me think. Right, so basically, that's kind of how like he being Supernova kind of dealt with this. And then we're going to go talk a bit about the Leenock game. Should I talk about that? No, I think we're going to skip ahead. There were some interesting things about that particular game, but it doesn't really it's not enough of not enough interest for me to go over specific details. So I'm going to go over this Supernova versus Seed game, and this is important because basically there are map changes instituted into Codes around this time period. Specifically, Cloud Kingdom and Antigua Shipyard are starting to come more into play. And this is important because basically Supernova identifies his own style of play, right? Like I said, very multitasking aggressive. And then when you go to TVP, he's doing the 1-1-1, he's doing that Thor Banshee shit. And then he recognizes, first off, that because of the maps introduced, he now has a new win condition. And that new win condition is multitasking the shit out of Protoss players. And the whole point, and this is where his like domino effect comes into play, like how he plays that particular style. And the first time I kind of noticed this was his game versus Seed on Cloud Kingdom in Season 2 of 2012. And I think this was the round of 32. So basically at this time period, when we're talking about Seed was one of the rising Protoss players, but this time period is more defined by parting style PvT. And parting style PvT is all about three base behind Blink Stalker into High Templar, or sometimes Charge Lot into High Templar, right? And the whole point of this is basically because Parting was a superior micro player to everybody else, and because he was a really great multitasker as well. Like you couldn't really deal with Parting himself if you played standard Terran into him, and then a lot of people, and because it was like changing the paradigm, a lot of people were getting caught off guard by what Parting was doing. And Seed kind of copied this, but here's the question here's one of the questions I can't really answer for you is how much did Supernova really understand Seed's lack of understanding or lack of ability to play this style? Because if you look at this particular game, Seed doesn't do the Parting style. What I mean by that is Seed does the same build, does the same composition, but he's unable to do the Parting style because he's not correctly splitting the Hard Templars. He's not correctly creating scouts or getting the right pieces of information he needs on the map in order to deal with high-paced aggression, which is what Supernova is going to use against him, especially on Cloud Kingdom. And this is where I think Supernova was very smart. It's because he looked at this particular map and realized because of the way the first and the third is positioned, you have a huge leeway into a lot of aggression by jumping off of those 2 points. And what Supernova does is he adds a little wrinkle to it. So basically, in this particular map, he hits natural first, actually. And this is surprising to Seed. Draws his army there, then he hits the main. Then Seed moves his army to the main, and then he hits the third with his actual army. And by that time, his army is so out of position, Seed can't do anything. Because, like I said, he didn't understand the parting way of playing, which was you were supposed to leave High Templars there, and then you're basically supposed to like do the correct amount of pieces and kind of like balance all the aggression. But Seed was unable to deal with that, and then Seed kind of dies to that kind of style of play, right? And then Supernova does this again against Genius on Antigua Shipyard, where he kind of uses the same type level of harassment, but it's not as effective against Genius. But what is important to note about this, it's in the same season, this game. What's important to know about this particular game is that if you remember the way I crafted the setup of Supernova and the reasons why he can't win in a TVP deathball battle is because he's unable to aggressively micro into a Protoss player. He just doesn't have the mechanics for it. But he knows how to passively micro, and there's a reason for that. It's just easier to do because he's attacking into you, so you don't have to worry about the mini game between your Vikings and his Colossus. It's easier to split backwards than it is to split forwards. You have a better convex into the concave. So plenty of reasons why. The most critical is probably also positioning. And if you look at like this is similar to his game against Seed on Daybreak in the previous series. Basically, Seed kind of does like the same, kind of does like a Colossus into High Templar transition to that game, but he doesn't do any of the important aggression. And so basically, Supernova just moves across the map and attacks. And the reason Supernova was able to win this game, sorry, I'm all over the place, but it's all in my head. Basically, the reason Supernova was able to win this game is because he puts his Vikings in that weird spot, in that weird high ground place, and makes it a lot easier for Supernova to micro that because it's a superior positional advantage for the attacker. So what he should have done, and what Genius does do later on when they play on Daybreak against Supernova of all people, is he just attacks. And if you just attack Supernova, like in that particular game, Supernova was caught off guard, but if you just regularly attacked and Supernova was on point, Supernova would have lost that fight anyway, just because I don't think he's a very good micrower. But going back to the Antigua thing, very long roundabout way of talking about this, is basically Genius is forced to, because of the harassment, Genius kind of feels like he's forced to attack Supernova to get something done, but the attack fails, Supernova wins the game. Now, you look at his game against Hero, and basically he has no win. He has against Hero, Supernova should have no win conditions. What I mean by that is Liquid Hero at the time was one of the best Protoss players, and he had all the aspects of what made a great Protoss player. He could play both styles. He was very high. He was very high in aggression, very good micro, very good multitasking. And so, if you went into a deathball battle with him, Supernova can't win that. If you went into a multitasking battle against him, Supernova is very unlikely to win that. And if you went into like an endgame, I think Hero is way more likely to win that. So, in general, like Supernova should not have had a chance to win here at all, and he doesn't. He goes 0-3. But if you look at the particular games, everything he does, he basically understands standard won't work against Hero because of the relative strengths. So in the first game, what he tries to do is, I think it's on Entombed Valley. He goes for Hero does some aggression and they place in a standard game. Standard at the time was like 2 base High Templar charge lot, and I think what Supernova does is he plays into like a Siege Tank Bio, and this is pretty rare, but here's what SuperNova was trying to do. He's trying to basically play a contain game where he was going to, where after he pushed Hero off the map, because that kind of style is pretty passive until you get a critical amount of units, he built bunkers in front, on the low ground in front of Hero's base, filled them with units, set up siege tanks, and tried to win the positional battle, try to choke out Hero. But then, if you just look at the micro, his micro is fucking trash. SuperNova's is, and they just get slaughtered when Hero moves out. But the idea is actually not that bad. His execution just wasn't good enough. Going to game 2. Game 2 is Metropolis, fucking massive map. And then he plays against the map. He plays against the map meta, because if you're looking at the map meta for a TVP, you probably should be playing a passive endgame deathball style. And obviously, if you think about it, like I've pointed out, basically if they did that, Hero is going to win like way more times than not. So SuperNova tries to catch Hero off guard with a very early aggressive attempt, dies, and then just gets rolled over by Hero later on because of it. Going to game 3. Game 3, he tries that Thor, Banshee, Marine all in, fails, but it's kind of, I like I said, I still think strategically speaking that was a better choice than going standard against Hero. Now we're gonna go into his Heart of the Swarm campaign, basically, because those are most of the games I want to talk about from SuperNova in his Wings Liberty time. And then you go to the Heart of the Swarm. I'll talk briefly a bit about his TVP, because basically early on, it's worth noting, like I said, I think SuperNova always understood his TVP micro was not good enough in the deathball battles. But the reason he has an uptick in the OSL period, and this is when Kespa is truly into the game, like everybody's starting on this fresh foot, and everybody's saying like, oh, none of these old ESF players can cut it anymore or whatever. The reason he has like an up spike period here is because SuperNova kind of like creates a shortcut, because like I said, he can't micro, but what he does do is he gets Hellbats. And the reason Hellbats are important for SuperNova's composition in the death battle is because not only does it allow him a natural way to aggress onto the Protoss players and end the game before you even get to the mid game, because they did a shit ton of damage to workers. The other point to consider is the fact that in a deathball battle, you don't actually micro Hellbats in a TVP. You just throw them at the Protoss, and then it creates a natural tank to absorb all the damage while you micro all the other stuff surrounding it. So this was a very helpful thing for SuperNova, as it kind of mitigated his micro problems at the death battles. And once Protosses figured that composition out, that's when SuperNova stops being good in TVP. So we're going to go over 2 games. Basically, I think these are the 2 best games SuperNova has probably played in his career, outside of that DRG game I talked about earlier. So we're going to go into them. First is the OSL. And at the time, there was the World Championship. I forget what it's called. Like Season 2 World Championship for WCS Season 2 World Championship. Something like that. Basically, the idea was, at the time, WCS was split into NA, EU, and then there's GSL. And then you have the top X players from each region come and play in like a unified championship thing for the season. And for Korea, they needed to decide who was going to be the 5th or 6th decider. And so they had to run another bracket in order to do that. And in this bracket, SuperNova plays against Sulky. And Sulky was, in my opinion, the best Zerg of that year in 2013. And so Sulky is way out of SuperNova's league here. But SuperNova wins. And why does SuperNova win? First off, I actually think Sulky kind of played himself in the first game. Because if you just think about the strategy, I think Sulky was a better macro player than SuperNova. So Sulky basically just all-ins SuperNova, and I don't think there was a reason to do that. Basically, I think he just played himself there and just gave SuperNova a free win. So that's part of it. And then the rest of the game, we're going to go into is basically SuperNova creates two, not creates, but one of them, he starts playing some unorthodox stuff in the game too, which is he starts playing mech. And this is pretty smart because if you just think about Sulky at the time, you can't really play it's hard to consider playing bio into him. And this was, I think it was, let me check the exact game it was. But basically, it was like a very massive map. And if you played this massive map into Sulky, like, you're going to get the same problem he has against DRG on Metalopolis, which is he's just going to run you around, and he's going to like outplay you in the mobile game. I think Sulky's going to win. And so that's why it didn't work out. It wouldn't have worked out. It was Akalon Waste. That's what it was. That's why he SuperNova kind of plays mech here, because if you play mech, you're trying to basically force the game into one death ball battle, and he avoids his like micro problems in the death ball battle by using mech and hoping that will be enough to catch Sulky off guard. Doesn't. Sulky's too good. Then go to game 3. Game 3 is a standard game, and this is one where it's hard to say. At least this is an interesting one, basically, because on the surface it doesn't strategically look like SuperNova's doing anything particularly great here, because he's basically playing a straight up standard game into Sulky, which is the Marine Medevac Widowmine style of play into the Mutiling Baneling style of play. Here's what's worth noting though, is because they're playing on Star Station, and the way the 4th is set up, it's actually pretty close to the Terran's 3rd because they play cross map. And so what SuperNova does is, in order to mitigate his disadvantages against Sulky and against this kind of style, like, he just makes sure not to engage on creep. And this is something a lot of Terrans didn't really have enough respect for at the time. Like, I actually think most Terrans just kind of ignored it. Like, if you just think about all the different Terrans, like, Innovation could ignore it because he was too good. Mario could ignore it because he was too good. But outside of that, like, majority of the Kespa Koreans didn't necessarily respect the fucking the creep advantage Zergs had, and this becomes a problem for the Kespa Korean Zergs later on in 2014 when they run to Tasia in like international tournaments, because Tasia is somebody who kind of played that passive style. Like, he'd take a frontal position right in front of the creep and then bait you into fighting, and this is basically what Sulky does. And so that's what makes it kind of unique and strategically pretty smart from Sulky's point of view. I mean, not Sulky's, SuperNova's point of view, is even though he's playing a standard style, he's going to abuse the map geography, and he's going to take his engagements in places where strategically it's better. He diminishes Sulky's strengths, basically, which is the death battle. And so if you do that, basically, and SuperNova does that, he goes into the macro game, just keeps pressuring, keeps trading, and then eventually kind of cracks Sulky. And then after that, you see something interesting. Basically, Sulky realizes that he's kind of been outplayed, at least in the straight up game. And so what Sulky does is he kind of reverts it back to a mobile game, and he starts really hammering home at SuperNova, doing all kinds of really aggressive backstabs, and that basically evens out the game. But SuperNova is still able to close it out just barely. And so if you're just looking at it from a strategic point of view, what SuperNova does is, what SuperNova and Sulky, like, let me rephrase that. Basically, the reason I think SuperNova outplays Sulky strategically here is because Sulky doesn't come up with the correct strategic answer until it's too late. What I mean by that is, I think he expanded first to the wrong 4th, because he expanded to the one where there's a high ground, and then Terrans can abuse that high ground. Because I guess his assumption was he was going to run over Sulky not Sulky, SuperNova eventually, when SuperNova stepped on the creep, but SuperNova never did. And so SuperNova kept abusing that geography, and that allowed him to even out the micro transaction between him and Sulky. And so when Sulky loses that base, he kind of realizes, oh, I have to shift this game into a very aggressive multitasking game. When in reality, if Sulky was strategically as smart as SuperNova, he should have realized immediately before the game even started that he probably should have been playing that style all along, because I don't think SuperNova has the mechanics to match up against Sulky head-to-head like that. And so basically, it's minute, but I think SuperNova definitely outplayed Sulky here strategically, and that's why I think he, in the end, barely wins this 1-2-1. Now, having said all that, like, you have to realize basically SuperNova is nowhere near the class of Sulky as a player, and I think Sulky basically gave him game 1 for free. But Supernova's strategy in the third game was the reason why he gets to beat Sulky and move on here. Now, the final game I want to talk about is in 2014, and it's actually in a Code game. And it's against TY. And TY is somebody I've compared. I'm not sure if I did it in this video or not, but basically, TY is somebody a lot of people consider a very smart Terran in the modern day StarCraft 2, and actually all the way since back in the Heart of the Swarm, to be honest. He's always had unique, unorthodox, multi-pronged aggressions, and in some ways he does resemble SuperNova, except for like the domino-like effect that SuperNova can have on a game. And what's important to note in this particular Code game is that two of them play a best of 3 in order to get into Code S, and TY was the better player at the time. Like, he was. But SuperNova was the smarter player. And so what I mean by that is, if I measure their win conditions between SuperNova and between TY, SuperNova's win conditions are as follows. He must outsmart TY. And that's a very vague win condition, but it's a very important one, because TY is superior in every sense, in almost every way. In multitasking, he's superior. Early game aggression, he's superior. Mid game, he's superior. End game, he's superior. Late game, he's superior. So really, this is a mirror matchup. You're not going to create dynamics like that Sulky SuperNova game, where SuperNova kind of like abuses the fact that Sulky wants to play this 1v1 game instead of playing the map so much, and is able to take that advantage before Sulky realizes he was playing the wrong strategy all along. Whereas in this game, whereas in this mirror matchup, it's very hard to force that off the rails as much. But SuperNova manages it. And what's great about this series is basically game 1 kind of shows you how this game should have gone if both players played standard. Because game 1, they both play their multitasking style, but it's a very long map. And the reason it's important to note it's a very long map is because SuperNova, in order to outsmart TY, he's going to have to get in TY's face and really control the pace of the game. And you can't do that so much on longer maps, and I think the map was Way Station. Now you go into the second and third map. Second map was on Habitation Station. Third map was on King Sejong Station. Both the maps had much closer distances between the mains and the naturals. And you should watch both of these maps, because basically, as smart as TY is, and a lot of people give a lot of credit to TY as being one of the smartest Terrans ever, basically SuperNova makes him look like a fucking idiot in both of these games. SuperNova basically forces these games directly into his domino type style. What I mean by that is SuperNova takes advantage early on, and then takes the tempo early on, and then just outsmarts TY the entire fucking way. It's absolutely amazing. I think these are the smartest. This series from SuperNova is one of the smartest TVTs you'll ever see. And like, I've recently rewatched this one. I've watched a bunch of the TVTs throughout the time periods. This is the one. Like, if you want to see someone just literally outsmart another guy, and we're talking about TY, who a lot of people consider one of the smartest Terrans alive, like, SuperNova is just a step above him in this particular series. So in Habitation Station, basically TY, both of them play pretty standard, but here's what Supernova does. Is he does Marine Mind Drop in TY's main. You think that's pretty normal, but TY kind of denies that, but TY is also building his command center in the expansion because that's a pretty normal thing to do at the time. But basically, Supernova abuses this because basically he keeps denying TY's expansion, and then from that point on, Supernova basically controls all of TY's army movements by using harassment. So by forcing the drop to go from the main to the natural, and then the natural back to the main, then he allows Hellions to come in. Hellions go out. Army comes down. Harass goes up. Another piece of harass comes in. And then when all that's done, all of a sudden you get 2 Cloak Banshees coming in at the same time. And TY has only built like 1 Raven. He can only deal with one at a time. And eventually TY gets so frustrated, he just all-ins. Just fucking all-ins Supernova. And by the time he all-ins Supernova, he doesn't have any Marines left because all the Hellions and Banshees have killed all the Marines. And this is deliberate by Supernova. Because by the time he gets over there, what does Supernova have? He has a Raven, Vikings, and tanks. So he just wins the siege war and forces TY to go home, and then just wins the game. And then you go into the game 3, and basically game 3 is the exact same thing. Basically, like TY at this point, I think it's hard to read into it too much, but basically, so here's what TY does. TY preps a pretty early game push using tanks, Raven, and Vikings to abuse the rock behind your natural. And this is a pretty standard push at the time, but it might have been in response also in terms of the series, in terms of what basically Supernova just did to him psychologically, where like he kind of or TY might realize, if I let this guy off the ground, he might just fucking run me over again, just like he did in the last game. But what's brilliant from Supernova is he has most of his units back at home, but he makes the drop at the same time as the push is pointing out. So basically he knows the timing, abuses TY for it, and then basically the rest of the game is TY trying to outpace Supernova, but Supernova being too smart for him, always getting the right harassment in, always controlling the tempo of the map, the positioning of the map, reading TY's hits. And even though TY is mechanically superior in terms of all the engagements, Supernova is just positionally smarter. Just a fucking brilliant series from Supernova. And among all the different games I've mentioned so far, this is the one where I think Supernova really only had one win objective, which was to outsmart TY, and he does it by playing his style of game. So I think that's it for talking about Supernova's Art of War. But to recap, this guy understood his own strengths, he understood his own weaknesses, and he had a lot of weaknesses. But he also understood his enemy strengths, his enemy weaknesses, and a lot of times he was playing against fantastic players. And so every series he played in, he always gave himself the best chance possible. And even though he'll never be known as like one of the best, or even I don't think he'll even be remembered in the general public. I'll always respect the fact that he always figured out his best win objectives, and he always tried to execute on those. So that is Supernova's Art of War. See you guys later.